For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 2A1 of Rule 9, I rise to give notice of my intent to raise a question of the privileges of the House. The text of the resolution is as follows: expressing the sense of the House of Representatives that the President shall immediately disclose his tax return information to the House of Representatives and to the American people. Whereas President Nixon explained that, quote, people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook, end quote, when he invited the Joint Committee on Taxation to audit his returns after the Internal Revenue Service gave him an unwarranted tax discount. Mr. Speaker, may we have order in the House so that all members can hear the resolution?
Gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Members are reminded to remove their conversations from the aisles and from the floor. The gentleman may resume.
Thank you. Whereas according to the Tax History Project, every president since Gerald Ford has disclosed his tax return information to the public. Whereas the chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means, the Joint Committee on Taxation, and the Committee on Finance authority to request the President's tax returns under Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986. And whereas pursuant to Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1 of the United States Constitution, often referred to as the Origination Clause, the House of Representatives has the sole authority to initiate legislation that raises revenue for the national government, and the Committee on Ways and Means is considering a comprehensive reform of the tax code. Whereas, according to media reports analyzing President Trump's leaked 2005 tax return, we know that had his own tax plan been in place, he would have paid an estimated mere 3.48% rate instead of a 24% rate, saving him $31.3 million. Whereas, according to the New York Times, the President used a legally dubious tax maneuver in 1995 that would have allowed him to avoid paying any federal taxes for 18 years. Whereas President Trump holds, quote, interest as the sole or principal owner in approximately 500 separate entities, end quote, according to his attorneys, and the President's tax plan proposes to cut the tax rate on such pass-through entities from 39.6% to 15%. Whereas one analysis estimated that President Trump would personally save $6.7 million from two tax breaks included in the Republicans' first tax cut, which they misleadingly call the American Health Care Act. Whereas without the President's tax returns, the American people cannot determine how much he will personally benefit from proposed changes to the tax code. Whereas an ABC News Washington Post poll found that 74% of Americans would like President Trump to disclose his tax returns, and the most signed petition on the White House website calls for the release of the President's tax return information to verify compliance with the Emoluments Clause, with more than 1,097,000 signatures as of the date of this resolution. Whereas disclosure of the President's tax returns could help those investigating Russian influence in the 2016 election better understand the President's financial ties to the Russian Federation, Russian businesses, and Russian individuals. Whereas after breaking his pledge to make his tax returns available, President Trump instead presented a one-page letter from a law firm giving him a clean bill of health on any business dealings with the Russians, but failed to note that the very same law firm boasted of the, quote, prestigious honor, end quote, of being named, quote, Russia Law Firm of the Year, end quote, for 2016. Whereas former Federal Bureau of Investigation Director James Comey, before he was fired by President Trump, publicly confirmed that the Bureau had been investigating potential ties between President Trump's campaign and Russia since July, and that Russian President Vladimir Putin favored a Trump electoral victory. Whereas President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner, met during the presidential
The House is in order. The gentleman will resume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whereas President Trump's son-in-law, senior advisor, Jared Kushner, met during the presidential transition at the behest of the Russian ambassador with Sergei N. Gorkov, a graduate of the school run by the successor to the KGB and who was appointed by Vladimir Putin to head a Russian state-owned bank that is on the U.S. sanctions list. Whereas Mr. Kushner proposed establishing a secret back channel of communications directly to Vladimir Putin, even considering the use of Russian embassy facilities to do so. Whereas Attorney General Jeff Sessions falsely stated during his Senate confirmation hearing that he, quote, did not have communications with the Russians, end quote, when in fact he'd met at least twice during the campaign with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak. Whereas former Director Comey testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee that President Trump had asked him in the Oval Office about, quote, letting Flynn go, end quote, referring to the investigation into former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn's business ties to Russia. Whereas President Trump stated on May 11th, 2017, that he decided that he was going to fire Comey because of, quote, this Russia thing. Whereas former Director Comey on June 8, 2017 testified that Special Counsel Robert Mueller could investigate whether President Trump's actions with regard to Director Comey and the Flynn investigation constituted obstruction of justice. Whereas in 2013, President Trump, Mr. Speaker, I know this is hard for some to hear, but they need to hear it, and I would ask for order here in the House.
Gentleman may resume.
Whereas in 2013, President Trump said, quote, well, I've done a lot of business with the Russians. They're smart and they're tough. And President Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., told a news outlet in 2008 that, quote, Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets. Whereas against the advice of ethics attorneys and the nonpartisan Office of Government Ethics, the President has refused to divest his ownership interest in his businesses. Whereas the director of the nonpartisan Office of Government Ethics said that the President's plan to transfer his business holdings to a trust managed by family members is, quote, meaningless and, quote, does not meet the standards that every president in the past 4 decades has met. Whereas the emoluments clause was included in the Constitution for the express purpose of preventing federal officials from accepting any, quote, present emolument, office, or title from any king, prince, or foreign state. Whereas the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. has hired a, quote, director of diplomatic sales to generate high-priced business among foreign leaders and diplomatic delegations. Whereas the Joint Committee on Taxation
Gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Members will be reminded to remove their conversations from the floor. Gentleman may resume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whereas the Joint Committee on Taxation reviewed the tax returns of President Richard Nixon in 1974 and made this information public, the Committee on Ways and Means used the authority under Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 in 2014 to make public the confidential tax information of 51 taxpayers. Whereas the Committee on Ways and Means has now voted 3 times along party lines to continue to cover up President Trump's tax returns. whereas the American people have the right to know whether or not their president is operating under conflicts of interest related to international affairs, to tax reform, government contracts, or otherwise, whereas the House of Representatives undermines its dignity and the integrity of its proceedings by continuing to cover up of President Trump's tax returns. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the House of Representatives shall, 1, immediately request the tax return and return information of Donald J. Trump for tax years 26 through 2015, as provided under Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, as well as the tax return and return information with respect to the President's businesses of each business entity disclosed by Donald J. Trump on his Office of Government Ethics Form 278E, specifically each corporation and each partnership within the meaning of Subchapter K of Chapter 1 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, where he's listed as officer, director, or equivalent, or exercises working control. And 2, postpone consideration of tax reform legislation until the elected representatives of the American people and the House have obtained President Trump's tax returns and return information to ascertain how many changes to the tax code might financially benefit the President. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
House will be in order. Under Rule 9, a resolution offered from the floor by a member other than the majority leader or the minority leader as a question of the privileges of the House has immediate precedence only at a time designated by the chair within 2 legislative days after the resolution is properly noticed. Pending that designation, the form of the resolution noticed by the gentleman from Texas will appear in the record at this point. The chair will not, at this point, determine whether the resolution constitutes a question of privilege. That determination will be made at the time designated for consideration of the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The unfinished